The year was 1944, and the thunder of war had ripped through Europe for half a decade. In the rolling countryside of France, where the scent of smoke and gunpowder hung heavily in the air, a small group of German women found themselves caught in the tide of history. Their uniforms, once crisp and orderly, now carried the fatigue of battle, the grime of forced marches, and the quiet weight of defeat. They were prisoners, captured, displaced, and uncertain of what fate awaited them. As they approached a sprawling American military camp, the sky above painted a somber grey, their footsteps hesitant on the worn dirt paths. Fear and suspicion clung to them like a second skin. Rumors of harsh treatment, rumors of scarcity and hardship had preceded their arrival. Yet as the gates opened, what awaited them was something utterly unimaginable. Long wooden tables gleamed under the soft glow of lantern light. Bowls of steaming food, fresh bread and ripe fruit overflowed in a symphony of abundance. The aroma of roasting meat and warm stew drifted toward them, carrying a promise that felt foreign and almost surreal. A hush fell over the women as they were gently guided to their seats. They exchanged glances, some incredulous, some overwhelmed, unable to reconcile the kindness unfolding before them with the stories of war they had carried in their hearts. For the first time in months, perhaps years, the harshness of survival was replaced by something tender, almost disorienting: hospitality. Here, behind barbed fences yet within human hands that sought no revenge, they were treated not as enemies, but as guests. The first moments in the dining hall were unlike anything the German women had ever imagined. Their boots scuffed lightly against the polished wooden floor, the sound strangely muted in the vast, high-ceilinged hall. Lanterns swung gently from iron hooks overhead, casting long, soft shadows that danced across the walls, highlighting the rows of neatly set tables and the glimmer of silverware. The air was warm, perfumed with the rich aroma of roasting meat, fresh bread, and simmering vegetables, a combination so foreign and tantalizing that it made their stomachs tighten with both hunger and disbelief. Some of the women paused mid-step, frozen by the sheer incongruity of the scene. They had been prepared for harsh barracks, cold rations, and the terse, businesslike treatment of prisoners. Not this. Not a feast offered with such careful, deliberate care, as if each plate, each loaf of bread, had been placed there with intention and respect rather than necessity. The American soldiers moved quietly among the tables, their movements deliberate and unhurried. Each tray they carried was balanced with precision, each plate set before a prisoner with a gentle nod and a soft word. The women's eyes followed them, wide and wary, searching for signs of mockery, of hidden cruelty, of the traps they had learned to expect in war. There was none. Every gesture, every smile, radiated patience and a calm authority that seemed almost alien. One soldier knelt briefly beside a young woman whose hands shook, quietly encouraging her to take a seat. Another, tall and broad-shouldered, adjusted a plate so that a steaming slice of roast lay directly in front of a prisoner, his voice low and soothing as he said, "Enjoy, don't worry." The words were simple, yet in that moment, they carried a weight the women had not anticipated. They had been trained to expect commands, to follow orders, to endure scorn or punishment. To hear kindness spoken aloud, to witness patience in motion, was jarring, unsettling, and, strangely, relieving. Their hesitation was palpable. Some of the women lingered at the edges of the tables, glancing at one another with wide-eyed uncertainty. Fingers fidgeted with the edges of uniforms, boots tapped nervously against the floorboards, and lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. The room itself seemed to lean in, patient, allowing them the space to reconcile disbelief with reality. Finally, slowly, a few of them stepped forward, trailing their eyes over the arrangements of the meal. Bowls of steaming stew glimmered in the lantern light, flecked with herbs and vegetables that released a comforting aroma. Slices of bread, golden and crisp, sat stacked neatly beside platters of roasted meats that shimmered with savory juices. A small bowl of fresh fruit gleamed with vibrant reds, yellows and oranges, apples, pears and plums that had been washed and polished to perfection. Some of the women's fingers brushed the edges of the plates almost unconsciously, as if confirming that these offerings were real and not a mirage born from hunger and exhaustion. The act of sitting down became a ceremony in itself. Each chair they lowered themselves onto seemed to anchor them in a reality both surreal and tender. One woman, her eyes brimming with disbelief, clutched the edge of the table with both hands, as if grounding herself against the tide of her emotions. Another, younger and pale from weeks of minimal rations, slowly reached for a spoon, inhaling deeply before touching it to her lips. The first taste was tentative, almost hesitant, a cautious dialogue between body and memory. It was not just food, it was a sensory revelation. Warmth spread through her chest, a sensation she had almost forgotten, mingling with the flavors that spoke of abundance, care, and attention to detail. She blinked, stunned, and a faint, almost involuntary smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Around her, the same pattern unfolded. Hands trembled, breaths caught, eyes flickered between the food and the faces of the soldiers who had prepared it. No one said anything, yet a quiet conversation filled the air, a shared understanding that something extraordinary was happening. Every movement of the soldiers reinforced this unspoken message. They did not hover or glare, they did not impose or demand. Instead, they worked with deliberate, almost reverential patience. Platters of stew were refilled, loaves of bread replenished, and small cups of water offered, all with a quiet dignity that seemed designed to counteract months, perhaps years, of fear and suspicion. Each action reminded the women that here, in this space, their humanity mattered. They were not numbers, not enemies to be punished or contained, not figures in a ledger of wartime calculations. They were people, and the care extended to them was evidence of that simple, radical truth. The room began to hum softly with the delicate sounds of acclimation, the scrape of cutlery against plates, the muted inhalation of the first bites, and the occasional quiet murmur of recognition blended into a gentle symphony. The women exchanged glances that held everything they had not yet dared to speak aloud. There was astonishment, yes, but also a fragile curiosity, and for some, a stirring sense of relief. A young woman with hollow cheeks broke into a small, incredulous laugh as she tasted the richness of the stew. Another, older and more wary, whispered softly to her neighbor, "It is really food, real food." The words floated between them, a tiny lifeline bridging the gap between disbelief and acceptance. Even as the war raged beyond the camp walls, here, in this room, the women were allowed a moment to exist simply as human beings, sustained and nurtured, not threatened or diminished. As the meal continued, small gestures multiplied in significance. A soldier refilled a cup of water without being asked. Another adjusted a plate to make it more accessible. A third offered a nod, a soft smile, a quiet acknowledgement that each woman's presence was honored. Each act was infinitesimal in isolation, yet together they formed a tapestry of compassion that the women could not have predicted. It was a slow, careful dismantling of the defenses they had been forced to construct over years of conflict. Suspicions softened into curiosity, hesitation gave way to tentative participation, and the initial shock of kindness gradually blossomed into a tentative, almost shy trust. The sensation of eating under these conditions, with such attentive care, was revolutionary. It demanded that the women reconcile two worlds, the world they had inhabited as soldiers, hardened by necessity, and this new reality where food was offered freely, warmth extended without expectation, and humanity was preserved even for those who had been labeled enemies. Every bite, every sip, every small smile exchanged was a silent testament to a truth more enduring than strategy or ideology. That compassion could exist even in the theater of war, that dignity could be offered without strings, and that even the most fragile human beings could be restored, if only briefly, through an act as simple as a meal shared with care. The hours in that hall seemed to stretch and contract simultaneously, a temporal distortion wrought by emotion and disbelief. What had been expected to be a brief, mechanical intake of sustenance became an immersion in something extraordinary. The women's bodies were nourished, yes, but their minds and hearts were engaged in a subtler, profounder process. The recognition of kindness, the acknowledgement of care, the internal reckoning with an unexpected humanity. Some eyes glistened with tears, unnoticed or unacknowledged, as the women dared to hope that perhaps the world beyond the camp gates was not entirely devoid of compassion. The act of receiving, simple though it was, had become transformative, planting seeds of astonishment, gratitude, and a tentative understanding of the complexities of human morality in wartime. The first meal in the American POW camp ended quietly. With no fanfare, no speeches, no dramatics. The women pushed back their chairs slowly, lingering in the warmth of the room, reluctant to let the moment end. Plates were emptied, but hearts were filled. They had crossed a threshold, however small, into a space where care replaced fear and generosity supplanted suspicion. The soldiers moved among them one last time, nodding, smiling, offering quiet reassurances before stepping back. In that pause, that fragile interlude, the German women understood that they had been given something extraordinary, a reminder of their humanity, a fleeting sanctuary amidst the chaos of war, and a memory that would endure far longer than any ration or barracks. Around them, the camp seemed to hum with a quiet, deliberate order, as if every detail had been meticulously arranged to convey stability, warmth, and calm. The German women, still absorbing the astonishing generosity of the first meal, began to notice the subtler elements of their surroundings, the things that might have gone unnoticed in a rushed or chaotic environment, but that here spoke volumes. The tables were immaculate, each setting precise, the utensils polished until they gleamed in the lantern light. Linen napkins, soft and neatly folded, rested beside each plate, and the wooden floors were swept clean, free from the mud and debris that had become a constant in their recent existence. Even the bowls of fruit, small and humble as they were, seemed to have been chosen with care, each apple and pear shining as though it had been hand-selected for this very moment. The women's eyes, accustomed to scarcity and rough handling, widened as they took in the scene. They observed the subtle signs of attentiveness. A cup of water replenished before it was empty, a plate rearranged to make reaching for it easier, a gentle nod from a soldier acknowledging their presence. These were small, almost imperceptible gestures, yet in their consistency, they conveyed an underlying truth that the women had been reluctant to imagine, that they were being treated not as enemies or mere captives, but as human beings whose comfort, dignity, and basic needs were genuinely considered. The first wave of shock began to soften, replaced by a fragile curiosity, a growing willingness to engage with a world that, at least in this room, seemed governed by care rather than fear. Some women began to speak in whispers, their voices low and tentative, testing the boundaries of this new reality. "Do they always do this?" one asked, glancing nervously at a soldier who moved calmly down the row of tables. Another shook her head, her lips pressing together as she struggled to form words for the dissonance she felt, the clash between what she had been told to expect as a prisoner and the reality now presented to her. The answers were neither obvious nor necessary. The mere presence of these small comforts, the warmth of a steaming bowl, the gentle handling of plates, the unobtrusive attentiveness of the soldiers, spoke more profoundly than words ever could. Each gesture communicated a simple, undeniable truth. Here, in this hall, kindness was not conditional, nor was it performative. It was real. Laughter began to weave its way into the air, tentative at first, a sound almost foreign to the women. It was low, staccato, and uncertain, yet its presence marked a subtle shift. They began to observe each other with a softer gaze, noticing the same expressions of disbelief mirrored in their neighbors' eyes. In one corner, a woman dabbed at the corner of her mouth, still unsure how to react, while the one beside her tentatively reached for a piece of bread, her fingers brushing against the polished surface of the table. The contact, though fleeting, felt almost intimate in its ordinariness. An interaction that under normal circumstances would be mundane, yet here took on extraordinary significance. Each small action reinforced the idea that the women were not being hurried through a necessary task. They were being given space, attention, and dignity, a rare gift for anyone, let alone for prisoners of war. The sensory details of the hall became ever more pronounced. The scent of spices mingled with the earthy aroma of fresh vegetables, creating an olfactory harmony that seemed to soothe the tension coiled in the women's bodies. Steam rose in gentle swirls from the bowls of stew, curling upward in slow, hypnotic spirals that momentarily caught the light and reflected off the soft sheen of the polished silverware. The warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the chill they had become accustomed to in camps and trenches, the heat of both the food and the air wrapping around them in a comforting embrace. The women shifted in their seats, some leaning forward with curiosity, others reclining slightly, letting themselves feel the unfamiliar sensation of relaxation in a place where vigilance had long been a constant companion. Every taste, every bite became more than sustenance. It was a revelation. The stew, rich with vegetables and tender meat, carried flavors that had been impossible to obtain during the preceding months of scarcity and fatigue. Each mouthful elicited small, almost imperceptible reactions. Widened eyes, the slightest inhalation of breath, a gentle nod of approval that spoke volumes about the surprise and gratitude welling within them. The bread, warm and fragrant, tore easily, its texture soft but substantial, and as they tasted it, some of the women's thoughts drifted unbidden to simpler times. Perhaps memories of family kitchens long ago, of meals shared without fear or necessity. These memories, dormant and fragile, resurfaced like a quiet tide, reminding them that they were more than soldiers, more than prisoners. They were human beings with histories, desires, and senses capable of joy. Even in the midst of conflict, the soldiers' presence amplified this sense of wonder. They moved quietly, attentively, never interrupting the fragile bubble that had formed around each woman, yet always there to anticipate needs before they were spoken. A cup of water was refilled just before it was empty. A plate was shifted closer with a gentle word of encouragement. A soldier bent slightly, offering assistance with such care that it seemed natural rather than imposed. The women, initially wary, began to recognize a pattern in these gestures, a rhythm of generosity and patience that gradually eroded the suspicion they had carried like armor. In this space, fear was gently replaced with a tentative, cautious hope, a realization that even amidst war, civility, care, and humanity could still exist. Eyes roamed the room, noting details that might have seemed inconsequential under normal circumstances, but now took on immense significance. Polished utensils reflected the soft glow of the lanterns. Linen napkins were folded with precision. Platters were never empty. Food was replenished, as if anticipating need before it was requested. Each detail spoke of planning, of thoughtfulness, of an underlying principle that even captives deserved respect. For the German women, whose lives had been marked by deprivation, uncertainty, and the unrelenting pressure of military hierarchy, this attention to detail was almost dizzying in its contrast. It whispered to them that someone had considered their comfort, had imagined their needs, and had acted without expectation of reward or acknowledgement. As conversation began to ripple through the hall, tentative and careful at first, the women began to form subtle connections with each other and with their hosts. A quiet question floated across the table. "Is it always like this?" Another voice replied softly, "I think so." "Perhaps." They laughed quietly, a sound hesitant and fragile, yet filled with a sense of wonder at the novelty of it all. They began to compare observations, remarking on the polish of the utensils, the warmth of the air, the tenderness of the stew, the gentle attentiveness of the soldiers. In doing so, they started to rebuild the social bonds that prolonged deprivation and suspicion had frayed, discovering in one another the reflection of their own astonishment and the validation of their feelings. The act of eating in this space became almost ritualistic in its significance. Every bite, every sip, every glance exchanged carried the weight of disbelief and gratitude. The women realized that in this room they were allowed to exist fully as human beings, not as the abstract enemy, not as figures in a ledger of wartime casualties, not as soldiers stripped of their agency, but as individuals with the right to nourishment, comfort, and dignity. Each gesture of care, each moment of attentiveness, reinforced this realization. It was a profound lesson in empathy and civility, delivered without sermon or explanation, manifesting in the simplest of human acts, feeding, observing, and acknowledging another's humanity as the meal progressed. Some women allowed themselves to relax more fully. Their posture softened, their movements became less hesitant, and their eyes, once scanning constantly for threats, began to linger on the faces of the soldiers and the fellow prisoners around them. Some even smiled cautiously at first, then more openly, as the room settled into a rhythm of quiet companionship. Each smile, each small laugh, each shared glance carried the weight of a collective recognition that amidst war, cruelty and suffering, compassion could still emerge in tangible, meaningful ways. These fleeting moments, brief though they were, would linger in memory long after the food was consumed and the hall emptied, etched deeply as proof that humanity could survive even in the shadow of conflict. By the time the meal drew to a close, the women were no longer merely participants in a routine act of consumption. They had become witnesses to something extraordinary. Every detail, from the polished utensils to the tender care of the soldiers, had conveyed a message that words could scarcely capture. That dignity, respect and kindness were not extinct, even in a world torn apart by war. The German women, initially frozen by disbelief, left the tables carrying a subtle transformation within themselves. They had experienced a revelation not of political ideology or military strategy, but of human connection, of empathy extended unconditionally, and of a rare, fragile hope that even in the darkest hours, acts of care could illuminate the world. As the meal began to wind down, a profound stillness settled over the dining hall, one not born of silence, but of introspection. The German women, whose initial shock had given way to tentative curiosity and then quiet engagement, now carried a subtler awareness of what this experience truly meant. Every glance they cast at their surroundings seemed imbued with a new perception. The careful arrangement of the tables, the meticulous replenishment of food, the patient attentiveness of the soldiers who moved among them, all of it became more than ordinary acts of hospitality. Each gesture resonated like a quiet declaration, whispering that they were not merely prisoners to be controlled or numbers to be catalogued, but human beings deserving of respect, dignity, and compassion. They began to understand in the slow, creeping way that revelation often works, that the meal itself was more than nourishment. It was a statement, a subtle but powerful assertion of humanity amid the brutal logic of war. Some of the women allowed themselves to linger longer, hands lightly resting on empty plates, eyes tracing the interplay of light and shadow across the hall. The lanterns overhead swayed gently, casting a soft glow on the polished surfaces of the tables, highlighting the remnants of the meal in a way that made even the smallest detail feel significant. Steam from the last bowls of stew rose lazily into the air, catching the light and creating halos that seemed almost ethereal. The warmth of the room contrasted starkly with the chill and discomfort they had grown accustomed to outside these walls. And for a moment, the world beyond the camp, the gunfire, the smoke, the uncertainty seemed suspended, as if the very air in the hall had been sanctified by the presence of care and attentiveness. Quiet tears began to appear on some faces, unnoticed or unacknowledged, as the women processed the gravity of what they were witnessing. They had lived under the constant pressure of survival, trained to suppress emotion in order to endure. Yet here, Amid the unhurried movements of soldiers, offering gentle smiles and encouraging nods, their defenses faltered. One young woman dabbed at her eyes with the edge of her sleeve, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to reconcile the kindness she had received with the harsh realities of the past months. Another, older and more stoic, exhaled a long, almost imperceptible sigh, a release of tension that she had carried silently for weeks. The act of receiving care, simple as it seemed, became overwhelming in its implications. Someone had prepared this meal for them, not out of duty or obligation, but out of conscious choice, guided by empathy rather than policy. The soldiers themselves remained unobtrusive, yet present, moving with a quiet efficiency that never intruded, always attentive. A plate that had been emptied was quietly removed and replaced. A cup of water was refilled before it was needed. A gentle word accompanied each gesture, soft enough not to startle but deliberate enough to reassure. Every motion communicated patience and respect, reinforcing a sense of worth that the women had long been denied. In that environment, the meal transcended its literal purpose and became a conduit for something much deeper. A recognition that even amid the horrors of war, civility, care, and dignity could endure. The subtle interplay between action and reaction, between gesture and reception, created a rhythm that the women slowly attuned to, each movement resonating in their consciousness and leaving an indelible impression on their hearts. The hall, previously a simple place to eat, became a theater of revelation. Women began to notice the minutiae that would have been meaningless in other circumstances: the glint of candlelight on a polished knife, the soft fold of a napkin, the way a soldier's hands adjusted a chair with meticulous care. These details, small in isolation, accumulated to form a narrative of attentiveness that contrasted sharply with their recent experiences of scarcity, cold, and impersonal authority. Each observed nuance reinforced the realization that this was not a perfunctory act of feeding, but a deliberate orchestration of comfort and respect. The careful arrangement of the environment, combined with the consistent, understated kindness of those serving, conveyed a profound message that they were worthy of care, that they were valued as individuals, and that their basic humanity was being acknowledged and honored. Some of the women quietly revisited the food, asking for second helpings with a mix of hesitation and wonder. The soldiers accommodated each request with the same gentle patience as the first, offering more stew, more bread, more fruit, without a hint of judgment or annoyance. The act, repetitive yet consistent, deepened the impact of the experience. Every bite became laden not merely with flavor, but with significance. They began to internalize the idea that survival could coexist with dignity, that sustenance need not be delivered harshly or grudgingly, but could be an expression of care and acknowledgement. In these moments, the line between enemy and host blurred, leaving behind only the shared, enduring human experience of nourishment and recognition. The atmosphere in the hall seemed to crystallize into something almost sacred. Conversations, still quiet and hesitant, now carried the weight of shared understanding. Women exchanged small observations, nodding at each other, murmuring comments about the warmth of the food, the tenderness of the meat, the attentiveness of the soldiers. Laughter, cautious and fragile, began to ripple more freely, weaving a thread of camaraderie among the prisoners. Even small gestures, a shared smile, a pointed comment about the fruit, a mutual nod of approval, became acts of connection that bridged the emotional distance imposed by fear and war. These interactions, seemingly ordinary in other circumstances, were transformative here, signaling that the women were not only receiving sustenance, but also the recognition that their presence mattered, that they could exist without suspicion or threat, if only for a moment. As the meal drew to a close, the realization of what they had been given began to crystallize. It was more than food, more than warmth or comfort. It was the restoration of a basic truth long denied, that they were human beings worthy of care. The American soldiers, through the simplest acts of feeding and attending, had imparted a lesson that was both subtle and profound. Each plate refilled, each cup topped up, each gentle gesture contributed to an overwhelming sense of inclusion and respect. The women left their seats carrying a quiet, transformative understanding that even in a world fractured by conflict and violence, there existed spaces where empathy could flourish, where acts of kindness could restore hope, where the simple human need to be acknowledged and nourished could be met without expectation or condition. In the days and weeks to come, the memory of that meal would linger for these women like a fragile yet unyielding ember. The simple act of being treated as guests rather than captives had created a permanent mark on their perception of humanity. They had learned, through experience rather than instruction, that the essence of care was not performative or transactional, but intrinsic, a deliberate choice to act with dignity toward another, regardless of circumstance or allegiance. The gentle attentiveness of the soldiers, the careful arrangement of the hall, the warmth and flavor of the food, all these elements combined into a singular, unforgettable impression that humanity, even in war, could assert itself in tangible and profoundly moving ways. By the time they left the hall, the German women had crossed an invisible threshold. They had entered expecting suspicion and left with the quiet certainty that dignity could be preserved, even in captivity. The meal had provided sustenance, yes, but also an unspoken promise that the world need not be entirely cruel, that compassion could exist even amid conflict, and that the smallest gestures of care could leave enduring imprints on the human spirit. Even as they stepped back into the uncertain terrain beyond the camp, the warmth, kindness and attention they had experienced would remain with them, shaping their understanding of what was possible in the midst of devastation and leaving an indelible imprint that no war could erase.